Hey there, small business owners. Welcome to the Tax Talk Podcast, the premier business podcast aimed at unlocking your unique potential. I'm your host, Jared Pallon, and I help my clients do three things: find common sense business solutions, minimize tax and maximize profits, and preserve your legacy. Each podcast episode will dig deep into an everyday problem that small business owners face, and most importantly, explore solutions to these problems. You ready to solve problems? Are you ready to keep more of your hard-earned wealth? And are you ready to preserve your legacy? Let's get to it. All right, good to go? As ready as you'll ever be.
I think so, yeah.
Cool. All right, welcome to the Tax Talk Podcast and episode 3 of the Bobcats, Bosses, and Breakups series. Before I jump into a little background on the episodes, just wanted to introduce today's guest, Mr. Caleb Henry. He is an associate with Red Deer's most prominent law firm, Johnston Ming Manning. Caleb, thanks for stopping by today.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Caleb practices in the areas of commercial, corporate, wills, estates. Feel free to reach out to him at any point in time. He'd be happy to assist you with any legal questions you might have. Looking forward to the episode today.
Yes, likewise.
So, I will give just a quick background on what these episodes are. So we're going back to 2007, just looking at my flatwork concrete business, checking out some of the mistakes that I made, bringing in some professionals that I probably should have had on team at that point in time to avoid a whole range of mistakes that I have now realized were probably fairly simple to avoid, and could have avoided a lot of headache if I would have just hired the right people on. So, without further ado, we will get into the first story. So, not long after opening up the concrete company, we decided to go out and lease a Bobcat, fairly necessary piece of equipment in our line of work. We were currently kind of working with a contractor that had an extra one available. He decided he'd be able to lease that out to us. And I don't remember the exact terms of the agreement, but I think we kind of picked it up on an hourly rate, and then we just kind of paid him every month. But within a few months into the agreement, we weren't using it a whole lot to kind of fill his expectations of what he wanted to see as far as rent came. So we ended up kind of coming back to the table, renegotiating things and putting in a new deal that was more based on, a set rate per month plus an additional charge if you went over hours for that month. Probably not a bad idea, but we hadn't kind of planned ahead for a number of different things. One, changing that agreement partway through, running into that kind of headache. And then two, just the whole, seasonal aspects of the business, not having that constant stream of revenue into the winter months, having to deal with the payments then. We scrambled around to get some extra revenue here or there, but, it didn't really make it justifiable to hold on to this piece of equipment. So just kind of want to look into some of the ideas behind, leasing, purchasing agreements, what you should watch for, when it would be a good time to speak with a lawyer, can agreements be changed partway through, those types of things. So I think the first one is just to, what should you be watching when you sign that lease or purchase agreement? Is there something specific that a business owner should be looking out for when they're putting pen to paper?
Yeah, well, let's start with the purchase agreement. It's a relatively simple thing to kind of get out of the way.
Sure.
Purchase agreement, basically you're going to be buying new,
Right.
sometimes you're buying old.
Okay.
If you're buying old, number one thing, get a PPR search.
Deal.
Pull that serial number, go into the registries and get a PPR search, personal property report.
Makes sense.
That way you can see if there's any debts owing on the thing, any liens or anything like that are on the machine. The last thing you want is to purchase it and then RBC come down the road and say, hey, they haven't paid my loan, I'm going to realize on my collateral
Right.
and take the skid steer away from you. I've seen that happen where it gets a little dicey and it gets interesting. You don't want that to happen. So do the PPR search. That's huge.
Okay. Good call.
If you're buying new,
Mhm.
you don't have to worry about PPR search typically. Typically the dealer has had nobody to own it before,
Right.
and you should be good to go.
Perfect.
You don't really need to get a lawyer involved on that end.
Okay.
You can get a lawyer on buying old equipment through somebody you don't know who's not a dealer. Even if
Gotcha.
you have a dealer involved on an old piece of equipment, do PPR search. Make sure you're covering your bases, because at the end of the day, it's on you. It's not on anybody else.
Makes sense.
Leases are a little bit more complicated because you gotta consider so many different aspects of what are your goals. You gotta figure out what your goals are for the piece of equipment. You gotta understand fully what the lease terms say. Everything from repayment to how many hours are being calculated. Some people think, okay, I'm gonna rent it 5 days. Well, what leases typically do is they limit what is a day.
Right.
So a day, is it 8 hours?
Right. That makes sense.
6 hours? Is it 12 hours? Lots of people think it's 24 hours. No, it's not. So if it's 8 hours, they actually have a hour counter on
Right,
there.
right,
So
right,
they'll be able to figure that out. So
Fair
make
enough.
sure you understand what exactly you're getting yourself into in terms of how you're being kept account for how many days you bring this piece of equipment on. Obviously, you're going to have to look at what are you responsible for. Are you expected to bring it back fully fueled up, oiled up? Are you even supposed to touch the engine compartment? Lots of
Okay.
leasing companies say don't even touch the engine.
Right.
Just if a light comes on, you stop, you call us.
Gotcha.
Just make sure you look at those, understand what your terms are. Now, of course, that's where lawyers come in. Lots of people, including the people who lease out this equipment, don't even know what's in their own contracts. So sometimes it's best, come see a lawyer.
Right.
Let them explain to you how the lease reads.
Okay.
And how the lease reads might not necessarily be what both the dealer and yourself even agreed to.
Right.
So it's just because people don't know what it says, because it's written in a harder language, unnecessarily hard language. So that can be remedied at the outset so that there's no pain and suffering at the end.
Okay. No,
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess kind of bottom line, if I'm leasing probably a used piece of equipment, good idea to get a lawyer involved. If I'm leasing maybe something new from a big equipment dealer or something like that, maybe it's worth it to check out a lawyer, but I'm
there's
probably
leasing and
fairly so.
purchasing, right?
Right,
So
right.
the leasing, even leasing amongst a big dealer, you
Right.
might want to get a lawyer
Okay.
involved, especially if you don't understand the terms. I've seen and
Right.
I've written some leases for some big companies, and they can be quite difficult to read, even at that, right?
Right.
So the big company wants something simplistic, but they hire a hoity-toity lawyer to write something, so they got to justify their hourly rate, so they write something very fancy that nobody seems to understand. So
Gotcha.
you got to keep that in mind. The contract is made so that it wins in court,
Okay.
but in the actual consumer gambit, nobody knows what it says.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, I guess going into the idea that, we had a bit of an agreement to start with and it changed, is that something that's, easily doable? Do both parties have to agree? Does that change have to come in writing?
Yeah.
What to watch out for there?
So contracts that are made orally
Okay.
are perfectly acceptable in
Right.
court. They're just harder to prove.
Right.
So that's why it's nice to have everything in writing.
Okay.
So oral contracts are enforceable, but written contracts are easily enforceable.
Right.
Easier,
Okay.
not necessarily easily. If something needs to be changed in the contract, everybody has to be involved.
Okay.
Everybody's got to sign a new addendum or a new amendment or something like that, preferably. You can make oral contracts with each other, so
Yeah.
you have your written, and
Okay.
then after the fact, you're like, the guy says, you know what, take it for an extra day free of charge.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that's an oral contract.
Right.
So you're gonna want to be a little bit careful about that.
Fair
Because what
enough.
if something comes up on his end where he's like, I need it back, or or you damage it or something
Right,
like that
right.
in that free day, and then that guy wants to sue you. Well,
Okay.
then what are you going to do with that? You could argue that it wasn't an oral contract because it was given to me for free.
Right.
It's not a contract. It was a gift,
Fair enough.
not a contract. So there's a lot of avenues there that you would have to look at. But ultimately, the rule of thumb is if you want to change anything into a contract, don't unilaterally change it. That's called a breach of contract.
Fair enough.
You want to meet with each other,
Okay.
meeting of the minds,
Gotcha.
come to a new agreement, sign away, and get your work done.
Okay, good point. So what happens then if someone does breach? Is that standard practice? Can you do that? Like say for instance, and I mean this didn't happen in our case, but say, a small business owner gets into a lease, can't deal with it going into, a slower period,
Yeah.
whether it's seasonal or otherwise, and they decide, well, I'm just gonna default on this because, it's either feed my kids or pay
Yeah.
my Bobcat lease.
Yeah.
Is that something that kind of
Yeah,
crops
so,
up?
so the first thing that has to happen is as soon as you think about breaching something,
Right.
if you have to make those really tough decisions between your kids and your Bobcat,
Right.
always choose your kids. But if it's
Fair
less severe than that,
Right.
then you want to look at your contract.
Okay.
First question I ask, see your contract.
Okay.
Because typically speaking, we're going to want to look through it and it's going to be enforceable. And lots of the time, these leases will have what's called a termination clause
Okay.
of some sort. It
Right.
doesn't necessarily need to be called that, but what it'll do is it'll set out what happens
Oh,
if somebody breaches, or if somebody wants a way out of the contract.
Okay.
What will that look like?
Right.
And lots of the time, those contracts will say, you know what, if you want to get out of this contract, then you got to pay me $500.
Oh, okay.
There's some sort of exit fee.
Right,
If
right, right, right.
if the contract doesn't say anything,
Mhm.
then that's where things get a little bit interesting.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's where we don't know really what's going to happen.
Okay.
You could just say you have 2 more months left in the lease,
Right.
and you say you give it back because you're like you can't make the payments.
Right, right.
Well, 2 months. Let's just say the 2 months worth are what, $5,000.
Yeah.
Let's just say $5,000 in 2 months. Well, $5,000. He might not even want to pursue you.
Right.
Might be a calculated breach at that point.
Okay.
And he'll just have to suck up that $5,000 loss, and then it's up to him though,
Right.
under the law, is to, if there's a breach of contract, he's got to what's called mitigate his damages.
Okay.
So, granted, he could have made $5,000 in those 2 months, but the law says you need to quickly turn that around and sell it, or lease it, or sell it to somebody else,
Oh, okay.
so that you mitigate that damage that you have felt.
Oh, okay.
So you lessen the damage that you felt.
Okay.
So at the end of the day, say, Jared, you breached 1 week,
Yeah.
and then in the next week I'm able to get it off the road again and
Right.
let somebody lease it for $5,000 for those 2 months, then your breach, the damages would be limited to that 1 week of downtime. That's about
Okay.
it. So
Gotcha.
it gets more complicated than that, but
Right.
it's basically that's
Sure.
the quick and dirty about it. But typically, if you breach within like the first month,
Right.
first approach them.
Okay.
Just tell them the situation. Perhaps you can work out some sort of situation.
Okay.
Nothing can be worked out, and you have no choice but to breach. Probably talk to a lawyer before you start thinking about
Okay.
that, because if it's a term, they'll sue you for the term,
Right. Right.
and it won't be good for you.
Right. Okay. No, fair
Generally.
enough. Fair enough. So I guess in closing this particular thought, is there anything else you want to touch on as far as lease or purchase agreements? I mean, I guess the theme is to maybe consult a lawyer early before either entering a lease or exiting the lease,
Mhm.
just to make sure you're kind of protected.
Yeah.
And I guess the overarching theme is, both parties still have some risk,
Mhm.
but as long as if the lease or an agreement is there and in writing, at least you have, some rules and something to enforce against if someone does decide to kind of go outside.
Yeah, and that's where these contracts, these leases are so incredibly important to get right sort of the first time.
Okay.
And granted that we live in an imperfect world, so you're always going to not cover, in these leases, you're not going to cover every possible avenue of a breach. One of the things, if you are in a business that is seasonal,
Right.
wherein you rely on snow, for instance, to come, and say there's no snow to come.
Yeah.
Well, then knowing that in your mind that you're in some sort of volatile, you rely on the weather.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to insert something in your lease where,
No,
you know
okay.
what, hey, if there is no snow that comes, I can bring back
okay.
the machine or half the rate or something
I
like
see
that.
what you're saying.
But then you have to determine, well, how much snow is enough snow, right? So you got to get really technical at that point. That's where the lawyer comes in and tries to make it tighten up the language a little bit to make sure everything. But that would be my only last parting thought on that point.
Fair enough. Nope, very good information to know, and keep in mind if you're in a lease or getting out of a lease. So, next story is kind of looking into how my concrete business ultimately fell apart and broke apart, I guess. So after a couple of years of business, things went in separate directions, we'll say. And I guess we kind of went down the initial path of, kind of trying to talk amongst ourselves, get some third-party mediation, and then eventually, lawyers get into it and try and find some sort of exit strategy that, would ultimately work for, I guess, all parties considered. In our case, none of this panned out whatsoever. As far as I know, the company might have gone on for a few more months after I ultimately left, but beyond that, I'm not 100% sure. But it was a frustrating period of time for sure. I guess going into the business and when we incorporated, we had put the shareholders agreement in place. I had a limited understanding of how those worked at that point in time, but it was, kind of my understanding that that would provide some protection to both of us should something, not work out the way we anticipated when we first started the business. But, just the way things played out, the shareholder agreement, I guess, didn't fit the bill or seemed to do what I thought it might do. And, at the end of the day, I think I was left with a lot of questions as to, you do all these things that you suppose and are told that are the right things to do, and then things still kind of fall apart and you still are unable to, get anything out of this deal when you're trying to get out of it. So I wanted to just kind of touch on, the shareholder agreement, what it does, who should get one, what happens when the company kind of winds down like this, what happens if you have to sue a business partner. Some of these things that you don't like to necessarily think about, but like I like to tell my clients now is, whenever you're starting that business, everybody's happy and planning for big revenue growths and huge sales numbers, and you don't plan 2, 3, 5 years down the road when you might hit a lean point or something happens and now you're at loggerheads. And those are the times that you need to be planning for, not these initial highs. It's those valleys. So, kind of, I guess, in fairly layman's terms, what does a shareholders agreement do for a business?
Well, your situation, first of all, your situation was an interesting situation.
It was.
Basically, Jared did everything that was right. You got the shareholder agreement, and then the shareholder agreement wasn't properly effectuated, I would argue.
Yeah.
And and that could be for a whole host of reasons.
Yeah.
We won't get into it now. But basically, what does it do for a company?
Yeah.
What is it, not for a company, sorry, but for a corporation?
For sure.
What it does is it provides stability first and foremost.
Okay.
It basically brings together all the shareholders and it says, you know what, Tom, Sally, you guys do this.
Right.
You guys do your thing.
Mm-hmm.
If something happens, this is what will happen.
Oh, okay.
You have this many shares, you have that many shares. Oh, we want to bring in more investors.
Right.
How many shares are we going to issue?
Okay.
Are we going to issue any shares?
Right.
What does that look like?
Okay.
Those are the sorts of things that the shareholder agreement attempts to look forward into the future and tries to fix those things before they happen.
Okay.
I mean, death clauses, divorce
Yeah.
clauses, stuff like that. So
Okay.
it's a whole host of things, and it all depends on who the parties are.
Okay.
Are we involving mom and dad,
Right.
sisters, brothers, friends,
Right.
business partner from Japan? Like who
Yeah.
we don't know.
Yeah,
It
for
could
sure.
be anything, and so
Right.
you have to tailor those shareholder agreements very specifically to what your goals are, what your
Okay.
company is, and what your business kind of entails, the values
Right.
that the company entails, and all those sorts of things. The
Okay.
age of the people, that's a
Right.
huge thing.
Yeah.
If one of the investors is auntie who has not very good health,
Mhm.
and she's a majority shareholder, you might want to get insurance on her. Stuff
That's
like
probably a
that.
good idea,
The corporation will get insurance on it. Those are the sorts of things that the shareholder agreement tries to
Okay.
attempt to provide.
Fair enough. So I guess that kind of leads into the next question. Who should have what in place? So if a husband and wife come in here and they're setting up a new corporation, is that something they need to kind of put in place right away? Or are we kind of looking at more of what I just kind of broadly term as a third party?
Yeah.
Or, your buddy, your uncle,
Yeah.
your brother,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, so hands down, if you have your brother, typically, if you have your brother, siblings, typically, parents, maybe,
Mhm.
but for sure siblings, for sure friends, you're
Okay.
gonna want a shareholder agreement.
Okay.
Just because, it just happens where you fall out with siblings quite regularly sometimes,
Yeah.
and that's just how it is. You want to protect yourself, and they want to protect themselves, and they have their own separate families, so
Yeah.
they want to
Yeah.
protect themselves. Where it gets interesting is with spouses.
Okay.
So it's one of those things where it's sort of like, okay, do you want to sign a prenuptial before you enter into a marriage?
Right.
Well, a lot of people, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, for some people, they say, well, that's just setting your marriage up for failure. So it depends on the perspective. So it's
Right.
sort of like, okay, well, I have my spouse, and I set up a shareholder agreement with my spouse
Okay.
with a clause in there that in the event of divorce or separation or that effect, what
Right.
happens? Well, then you can have some interesting conversation there that might not be healthy for the relationship, but very healthy for the business.
Okay.
And so those are the sorts of things you really need to look into, and honestly, go to a lawyer for that sort of thing.
Okay.
Solicitor-client privilege.
Right.
You go in there and you just talk to them and say, hey,
Okay.
as a couple, come in and you just hash it out in the
Right.
boardroom, and there's no pressure. You don't have to sign one
Right.
for a corporation. But if you're, typically that's a tough one. That's a case-by-case basis.
Right.
That's what I would say for who should have one, who shouldn't have.
Because I know I've dealt in the past where you do get into that divorce situation.
Yes.
Could you run into a scenario that if it wasn't necessarily stated specifically in an agreement, that maybe some of the business dealings of that corporation could be put on hold because there is that ongoing kind of divorce?
Yeah, so it depends on the situation, obviously. So
Right.
if it's a business that's just basically it's going without your involvement,
Right.
you just have shares in that.
Yeah.
The shares just are held
Yep.
there, but the company's still going, and that's just how it rolls.
Okay.
So the divorce won't necessarily hold that up.
Okay.
But what happens a lot of the time is and that's another point, I guess, to quickly recap on the shareholder agreement, is sometimes gives a formula on how to value your shares should something
Yeah,
happen.
that's a good point.
So that's one of those things where in divorce situation, I'm not a family lawyer, full disclosure, but from what I know from law school and dealing with it here and there,
Yeah.
one of the biggest issues is how do you value the shares?
Right.
So husband wants the wife's shares in
Mhm.
that corporation, and the wife is like, wow, they're worth $10,
Right.
and it's a multi-million-dollar corporation. You go, well, probably not.
Right.
And then once you determine a valuation, then you got to determine who's allocated what.
Okay.
So is it if it's split or whatever?
Right.
And that's where it gets family law. That's that realm. I stay out of
Gotcha.
it.
Gotcha.
But those are the sorts of things that you're going to want to look at. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Divorce proceedings can definitely halt
Okay.
things. Now, if you have a shareholder agreement that contemplates all that,
Right.
you're much better ahead.
Okay.
Much better ahead, to a point that it's almost not going to be much of an issue if it's clearly stated in your shareholder agreement.
Okay. So something to keep in mind then for sure.
It's a tough conversation to have with your spouse.
Yeah.
But, I mean, nobody knows the future, so that's
Right.
the thing. And everybody's, like you said earlier in your preamble, which was you come into the business relationship thinking that it's going to be glorious. Fast forward 5 years and you have no money, no further ahead.
Right.
Everybody's unhappy with each other.
Right.
How do we separate amicably? That's the idea.
Gotcha. So I guess, are there a few set situations where the shareholder agreement then comes into force? Are there, maybe specific things that people can add in there to
Yeah.
mitigate their own risks?
Yeah.
Or,
Well, so like triggering events. Is
Yes.
Shareholder agreements will let's just do one of the most simplest triggering event there is. It's in a situation in which a shareholder is both an investor,
Right.
shareholder, by virtue of the investment, has money in the company, and who's an employee.
Okay.
Okay, what do you do with that? Okay, the employee, let's just say this person just sucks at their job. Like just sucks at their job. There's no other way to it. Like cannot bring in a customer for the life of them.
Okay.
Okay, do you want them as a shareholder? Sure. Do you want them as an investor? Yeah. Do you want them as an employee? No.
Right. Right.
So does the shareholder agreement contemplate that?
Okay.
So the triggering event is sucky employee. So
Gotcha.
if you have a clause in your shareholder agreement that contemplates a
Okay.
bad employee relationship,
Right.
then you can successfully mitigate those sorts of situations.
Gotcha.
And potentially, depending on the situation, depending on the investor, that's where you got to be careful. If you have a high-profile investor, you're not going to want to make them as your employee.
Okay.
Because if you kick them out of their employment, they
Chances
probably
are the
want their
dollars.
money. Yeah, so you want to be careful there. Those are the sorts of things you want to look at there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. And then I guess the other ones would be death, disagreements, and
Disability.
disability. Right,
Disability is another one. Death. The other, common ones are where you just can't make up your minds. You have
Right.
one director that
Right.
says, I want to take the company to McDonald's, and
Right.
the other one says, I want to keep it to the food market, to the farmer's market.
Right.
Those are polar opposite differences. And that's where there's certain clauses in shareholder agreement, talk to your lawyer about or your
Right.
accountant about. Basically, you can force the other person to buy you out or buy them out, sort of
Right.
thing.
Right.
And so at that point, that's where it's really important to have a clause in there that values their shares.
Okay.
So that's where, if you're going to offer them money, you got to know exactly what the value of the company is, i.e., the value of their
Right.
shares, or their shares rather, and vice versa.
For sure.
So things are going to be quite interesting there. The other thing that just come to mind with shareholder agreement, something that's really important, is that it prevents, more or less, tries to prevent, where directors, sometimes this happens, where
Right.
directors are doing fantastic, their shares are booming because the company's booming.
Mhm.
They're like, you know what, I'm going to set up a sister company on my own across
Okay.
town. Oh yeah. So, and I'm going to take a couple of my customers with me.
Right.
Now what happens? Well, there's a ton of arguments there that can be made in law
Right.
to help fix those situations. But those are sorts of things that in the shareholder agreement they try to prevent those by kind of telling you what's going to happen before it happens, so that everybody knows what's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's basically, at the end of the day, kind of a rule book
Yeah.
that everybody can kind of sign on to.
That's right.
It says, you do this, you do this.
Yes.
If these things happen, then this is gonna happen. And then everybody has, a bit of certainty going into this relationship to
Yes.
say, at least we can kind of make some decisions and have some somewhat clear expectations of what are gonna happen.
Yeah, and certainty is good for investments.
Right.
So if you're wanting to bring investors to you, you want some level of certainty.
Gotcha.
You don't want investors to come and look at the books and say, "Where's your shareholder agreement?"
Right.
Oh, well, we don't have one, sir. Well, you have 5 investors
Right.
and no shareholder agreement? Okay, so what's going to
No.
happen if you get hurt?
Right.
And you're like our lead operator.
Right.
Like, what's going to happen there? So that's the shareholder agreement provides a lot of certainty for the future investors for sure.
Gotcha.
And that's why it's very crucial to have some sort of shareholder agreement that is drafted properly.
Right.
Typically by a lawyer, but just some lawyers are better than others. Let's just put it that way.
Fair enough. So I guess on the last kind of part of this is kind of tying back into that shotgun clause that you were talking about. And, you know, what happens if you get to this point where you gotta break off, you gotta use this, you know, can you sue your business partner? You know, what is the best way to kind of deal with these worst case scenarios?
So your situation was almost the worst case scenario.
As far as I can tell.
Yeah, it was basically you had a shareholder agreement, but nothing came of it.
Exactly.
Now you went into a lot of mediation.
Correct.
Was it 6 months?
Something
6
like
months
that.
mediation,
Yeah.
roughly. Something like that, you might have wanted to go straight to the courts.
Okay.
Get the ball rolling, get people talking.
Okay.
So courts will get people talking all the time because nobody wants to go to court.
Right.
Even lawyers, they don't want to court. I don't want to go to court. It's a lot of work, a lot of hassle,
Gotcha.
a lot of stress.
Okay.
So it motivates me as a lawyer if somebody is suing my client
Okay.
to try and come to some sort of agreement. Now, of course, I have no issues going to court.
Right.
I will go to court if there is no agreement
Yep.
to be had.
Yep.
Other lawyers will do the same.
Yep. Yep.
It's motivating when somebody's suing.
Gotcha.
So that's why these mediations probably weren't too fruitful for you.
No, I think there was a lot of tire spinning and
Yeah, that's exactly
Nothing
it.
happened.
And also your situation, there wasn't a lot of money, I don't
No,
think.
no.
And so typically when something breaks up, typically when a shareholder agreement requires somebody to buy somebody out, like in a shotgun
Yep.
clause,
Yep.
basically money has to exchange hands.
Right. Yeah.
Well, what if the company has no money?
Exactly.
Well, then that's a problem. So that's where things get a little bit interesting. And,
Right.
and so typically for something like you, probably should have just dissolved the corporation, sold its assets,
Right.
paid off its debts, and then paid you guys yourselves out
Right.
accordingly. And probably that would have been the best remedy here. But
Right.
if somebody doesn't want to,
Right.
well, then there's legal remedies that you would need to pursue.
Okay.
You need to talk to your lawyer about that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And if you had that shareholders agreement kind of in place, that would give you some legs for pursuing that
Yeah.
liquidation?
Yeah, so there are protections within the certain pieces of legislation in Alberta and Canada. So the
Right.
Corporations Act, their Alberta Business Corporations Act, Canada Business Corporations Act.
Okay.
So those are the acts that kind of set guidelines for certain remedies that can be
Right.
pursued by certain shareholders or
Gotcha.
directors or whatever. But sometimes you have those statutory remedies, but you also have certain remedies that you might have at your disposal in the agreement themselves,
Okay.
in which you can sue on and on those bases alone, which is really, really helpful.
Gotcha.
So it is super handy to have that shareholder agreement. But the shareholder agreement, if you didn't have a shareholder agreement, then you would have to typically, not typically, but sometimes you'll have to go to court more likely on that than you
okay.
would on a shareholder agreement. If you have a shareholder agreement that's nicely laid out
Right.
and clear,
Mhm.
basically it just takes 2 lawyers in the room and they're like, you know what, we read the same thing, which is very rare. That 2 lawyers can read the same thing and come to the same conclusions. Typically they'll try to figure their way out of those sorts of
Right,
things.
right,
But
right.
honestly, if it's something that's as simple as the writing on the page and you know
Okay.
what, it's quite clear to everybody that this is what should happen, then it's really hard to get out of that if you guys both agreed to it originally.
Okay.
Barring duress and all those fraud and all those
For
sort
sure.
of
Yep.
defenses.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I guess in closing, are there any kind of tips that you'd like to give to small business owners, just as a general closing
Yeah.
thought?
So, small businesses. What does that mean, Jared? That means not very much money typically.
Usually.
Usually.
Yep. Yep.
I get that. Very little money.
For sure.
It's hard to justify a lawyer.
Okay.
It's hard to justify an account. It's
It
hard to
can be.
justify those sorts of services. And you're like, you know what? I just want to get this rolling. I'm just
Right.
going to pull off of, what is it, legal notes or whatever off online,
Okay.
those free
Yep.
stuff.
Yep.
I can tell you from experience that free stuff is so bare bones
Right.
that there's no point in doing it.
Okay.
It just confuses things.
Oh, okay.
It's better to take that time, put some money away for those legal fees.
Okay.
Another piece of information is don't hesitate to find a lawyer that will give you a free consult.
Okay.
Now keep in mind, consults are defined two different ways amongst the legal world. The one way is consult is I hear your problems
Right.
for a half hour.
Gotcha.
I don't give you free advice.
Ah, I see.
The second interpretation, which is the interpretation that I hold, is I will give you advice during that free consult.
Okay.
And hear your problems at the same time. It's
Gotcha.
just nonsensical in my mind to hear your problems and not actually actuate any sort of problem solving in that.
That's fair.
So look for a lawyer that will actually give you a definitive consult,
Okay.
somebody who's going to actually help you at a discounted rate.
Right.
Lawyer referral program has the half-hour free consultation. You can definitely go on to.
Okay.
I'm part of that community, so they give you three lawyers. You call all three and you say you're for the law society law referral,
Okay.
and you get a half-hour free consultation.
Gotcha.
But even within that program, that half-hour free consultation can be defined two different ways. So do keep that in mind. One other last piece of information is if you want to look at some, and this is sort of this is just kind of insider knowledge,
Sure.
is if you want cheap legal advice,
Mm-hmm.
but have some sort of expert in the background backing
Okay.
up that advice, seek out a student at law.
Okay.
Now everybody says student. I don't want a student. I want the real McCoy. Well, fine. You can get the real McCoy. You're just going to have to pay more.
Right.
You got to pay for that experience. You got to pay for that expertise.
Gotcha.
The student at law doesn't know very much.
Right.
But that's what makes them so good. Is that they dig further, typically.
Okay.
They dig
Okay.
in, they do more research,
Right.
and if they can't find anything in their research, guess where they go to? They go to a senior lawyer. And the
Gotcha.
senior lawyer typically doesn't bill on the file
Oh, okay.
and will give that information for free, and then the student relays that back to you.
Good to know.
So there's some savings to be had there.
Right on.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Caleb, I just wanted to say thanks again for taking
Welcome,
some
thank you.
time out of your busy schedule to hop on the podcast. Actually, our second running of this because I malfunctioned the camera last time, so we're hoping that this one turns out.
Yeah. No doubt.
So I know you provided a great deal of value to all the listeners. Whether you're starting the business up or you're full on into it and you need some legal advice, Caleb's definitely a good option to go to. What is the best way the listeners can get a hold of you?
Email is preferred.
Okay.
Just on our website, Johnston Ming Manning
Okay.
.com. I don't know what it is, but you just Google Johnston Ming Manning Red Deer Lawyers or something like that. Find my profile. There should be a link for my email.
Okay.
You can just grab that link. Otherwise, you can call the main line, ask to speak to Caleb Henry,
Sure.
book an appointment, or just have a quick talk with me over the phone. I'm more than willing to do that for you. I do have a heart and a passion for small businesses, so that's something that I do pride myself in doing, is helping the small business. So do utilize that service if you're in the Red Deer area, or the larger area. I would greatly appreciate the business, and I would also appreciate helping you further your business. So thank you for listening.
Sounds good. I will definitely put all that information in the show notes for anyone that's looking for it. And I think that's it for the Tax Talk Podcast. I'm Jared Blond. Thanks for listening. Take care, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. That's